We have a target sum. It's now time to generate the actual numbers that the player is going to use to sum up to the target. So before we do that, let me talk about my decision to keep this target div in this top level game component and not create a child component just to represent this target div. This is definitely a style preference. If you want this target div to be contained and you want the style of this target div to be contained, then a child component to represent this target div might be worth it. However, a child component to represent this target div also introduces some complexities. So it's just something that you need to decide on. I decided to keep this target text in this game component for many reasons. But one of them is that it's the only text of this type, the target text. And the other reason is that a lot of the calculations in this game component are going to depend on the value of this target. So introducing a child component here is going to introduce some data flow complexities in the game. And I'm trying to keep things simple. Okay, so now we need to create a text element for every random number that the player is going to use to play. But before we do that, let's think about it. First of all, this number of random numbers, I'll call it random numbers count, is something that we probably should control in every game. So for example, I might render a game with 6 random numbers, and then I might render another game with 7 random numbers to make the game a little bit more difficult. So it's definitely something that we should pass to the game from the top level component that controls the game. So let's call this random number count. And let's render our first game with 6 random numbers. This is the first prob that I am designing for the game component. This means inside the game component, when I use this prob anywhere in here, I'll use this .props.random number count. It's going to be 6 by default, but I can absolutely render a game with a different random number count. So I'm going to actually go ahead and render this inside the text just for testing. This .random number count and make sure that I'm seeing the value here. However, since I introduced a new prob for this game component, I should define the type of this prob using prop types. In fact, the recommended ESLint configuration should warn you if you're using a prob without defining its type, but I actually turn off this recommended setting. But for this example, let's turn it back on by removing this line. And if you do that and you use any prop type, you should now get this message that random number count is missing in prop type validation. Yes, it is. Let's fix that. Import from prop types. This is the package that we need now. It's now a separate package. We imported from prop-types. This used to be part of React, but now it's own separate package. And the prop type definition is a static property on the game component. Prop types, this is camel case. And inside the object that represent the prop types, we put a property for every prop that we design in this component. So we have random numbers count, which is prop types dot string, and it is absolutely required. We cannot render a game component without random number count. So now we want to take this random number count, which starts at 6, and we want to have an array of random numbers so we can render that array inside our game component. And just like we placed the target number on the instance of the component, we can also place this array on the instance of the component. Let's call this array random numbers. So this array is somehow driven by the random numbers count property. To create an array from a number, there is a JavaScript trick we can use. It's array.from. And you give this from an object, and inside the object you define the length of the array that you want. So I want the length to be this.props.random number count, just like that. This gives me an array of 6 undefined elements. And then I can map this array into actual random numbers here. So for example, this is going to give me a function for every element in the array. And I can use an expression similar to what I did for the target here to create random numbers here. Maybe we'll have these random numbers start from 2 up to, say, maybe 10. Let me fix the indentation here. So this will actually work. This will give us an array of random numbers, but we have a logical problem here. We can't just generate any set of random numbers. We need random numbers with the possibility of summing up to target, which is another random number here. So to do that, you might be tempted to start thinking about factoring this target number and somehow figure out some factors that will sum up to that target number and then fill the rest of the random numbers count array with random numbers. But that's actually a lot harder than it needs to be. In fact, if we just change the order of these operations, if we start with the random numbers and then do the target after that, we could derive the value of the target from the random numbers themselves. Maybe we'll sum 3 or 4 or 5 out of these random numbers and say, this is our target. And this way we would be sure that the random numbers have a possible solution to sum up to the target. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to start with this.random numbers, and I'll slice this array because I don't want the whole random numbers. So let's take the first 4 numbers and sum those. Now, of course, the random numbers count is dynamic, so I can't just say give me 4 to get the first 4 numbers. Let's do this .props.random number count minus 2, right? And I just figured out there is a typo here, so it's props. This .props.random number count minus 2. This would give me an array of the first 4 numbers, and I can sum that array. So I'll put this on its own line. The easiest way to sum an array without introducing any new libraries is just to use a reduce call. And the reduce gives you access to an accumulator and a current element. And you can return the accumulator plus the current element. And you can start from 0, fail-safe. You actually don't need it in the sum case. But in case the array that you sum is empty for some reason, you need this fail-safe. So just use it. And now we can test. Instead of outputting the random number count, let's output the random numbers themselves. Let's actually see if that works. And it did. I am seeing the warning here. Invalid prob of type number supplied to game, expected string. Totally. Random number count is not a string, it's a number. That was a very helpful React warning to uncover something wrong that we did here in the prop types. Okay, so instead of rendering the random numbers directly here, let's render them each in their own text container. So I'll go ahead and map this array. This will give me a single random number. And I'll map that random number into a text by itself. So the map is going to give me the value of each random number, a single number. And I can render it here. Random number. Now, the very helpful ESLint is telling me that I'm missing a key prop. Remember that every time you have a dynamic list of children that you're rendering in here, you need a unique key to represent each child. Now, I can't use the random number itself because it's not unique. I might pick 2 same random numbers, but I can use the index of that, the position of that random number in the array. Now, in general, using the index is not actually a very good idea if you are reordering the items or if you're deleting or updating the items, because React is going to be confused when you delete an item and it will reposition the array and bad things will happen. But for our particular case, we are not going to rearrange or delete any items. We are just clicking on those items and we just need to identify them when we click on them. So that is probably okay for this particular case. If you need to delete or reorder things, the solution is to give every number a unique ID. Instead of just a value, you can represent every random number with an object and give that object its unique ID. But I think it would be a case of over-engineering if we did this for this particular app. Okay, so let's test that. And now we can tell if 22 is actually the sum of the first 4 elements, and it is totally the sum of the first 4 elements. By the way, this 4 elements here can also be customized. So instead of doing random number count minus 2, we can pass a property, for example, that is sum number count. But I'll keep it simple. Once we're done with the MVP of this game, there will be a lot of room for improvements, and I'm going to actually challenge you with some of those improvements at the end of the game. So let's go ahead and style these numbers now. I'll do my styling off camera. If you want to be creative, do your own styling and test your knowledge in the subset of the React Native styles that you can use. I'll show you the styles that I'm going to come up with in the next video.